Beneath the official histories, in vaults without names, there are files no archivist dares to claim. They smell of damp paper and cold metal, their words smudged by hands that vanished long ago. Each page is a shadow, cast by events too dangerous to acknowledge. You won't find these stories on any map, yet their influence is etched into borders, alliances, and the quiet terror that nations carry in their bones. The surviving field diary of 1st Lieutenant Raymond H. Collier, 126th Infantry Regiment, 32nd Division, records the morning of May 4, 1945, in stark and unadorned lines. Weather cold, light mist, advancing east. Abandoned mine shaft at grid ref 51 degrees north 13 degrees east. Local says Germans removed machinery at night. Faint smell of fuel. Orders to investigate. By then, German forces in Saxony were collapsing. The war in Europe would officially end in 4 days. The 126th, advancing through the Ore Mountains south of Chemnitz, had been tasked with sweeping for bypassed Wehrmacht units and securing industrial sites before Soviet forces could claim them. The mine shaft referenced by Collier was one of hundreds in the region, its wooden barricade hastily nailed in place and stamped "Gefahr" in flaking red paint. Sergeant Michael Petrovich, attached as an interpreter, recalled in a 1962 oral history that the barricade was partially dismantled within an hour, revealing a shaft reinforced with steel struts and lined with fresh electrical cabling. The mine was dry, unlike most in the area, and the air carried a faint chemical tang. 40 meters down, the squad entered a vaulted chamber that was clearly not of standard mining design. Floodlights illuminated drafting tables, a bank of filing cabinets, and the skeletal frame of a cylindrical structure nearly 15 meters long. The equipment bore Reich Sadler stamps and "Hier ist Versuchsanstalt" serial numbers. A brass placard bolted to the cylinder's frame read, Eisenflamme, Stufe 3. Rough translations yielded Iron Flame, Stage 3. Technical drawings on a wall showed cross-sections of a multi-stage rocket fitted with a sharply tapered nose cone and large control surfaces, design elements far more advanced than the V-2. By mid-afternoon, word had reached Lieutenant Colonel John McGuire, 32nd Division G2, Intelligence. He ordered the site sealed, and communications regarding its discovery were routed through encrypted SCR-299 transmissions to U.S. 1st Army HQ. 2 days later, an OSS technical recovery team arrived under the cover designation T-Force Scientific Detachment. The locals were told the mine had been sabotaged and was unsafe. Recovered materials included 12 crates of engineering blueprints, metallurgical test samples, and fuel composition reports referencing C-Stoff and T-Stoff in quantities that exceeded any previously known German rocketry projects. One folder, stamped Geheim, nur für den Führer, contained a memo from General Major Walter Dornberger, dated January 17, 1945, proposing an Amerika Reichweite, America Range, demonstration to force a negotiated settlement. The delivery method described a high-altitude, multi-stage launch vehicle capable of exceeding 5,000 kilometers. The Eisenflamme materials were flown under armed escort to a secure OSS facility near Le Havre, then shipped to Fort Strong, Boston Harbor, under the innocuous cargo manifest, machine parts. No public record of the mine's contents appeared in post-war reports, and even the 1946 congressional hearings on Operation Paperclip made no mention of Eisenflamme. Soviet records declassified in the 1990s suggest they were aware of the site through NKVD agent reports in May 1945, but arrived too late to secure physical evidence. One GRU memorandum speculates that the OSS deliberately delayed Soviet advances in the sector to guarantee sole possession of the technology. Between 1947 and 1954, fragments of Eisenflamme documentation were quietly integrated into U.S. Air Force ballistic missile research at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Engineers familiar with the files were required to sign lifetime non-disclosure agreements under penalty of espionage charges. A redacted Air Technical Intelligence Center (ATIC) report from 1951, still missing several appendices, notes that Stage 3 design remains beyond our current metallurgy capabilities for sustained atmospheric re-entry without catastrophic thermal failure, implying an active effort to replicate the original specifications. Lieutenant Collier's diary vanishes from the record after June 1945. His family reported it stolen during a burglary in 1949. In 1961, the year of his death in a car accident, a single page from the diary surfaced in the private archive of aerospace engineer Herbert K. Lang, who had worked on the Titan II program. The page contained only 2 words in capital letters: "Nothing buried." Interviews with surviving members of the 126th in the late 1970s reveal a persistent unease about what they had found. Petrovich described being ordered at gunpoint by OSS officers to surrender his own personal photographs of the chamber. Another veteran, Corporal Alan Drexler, recalled a final, cryptic warning from an intelligence captain: "You didn't see it, you didn't hear it, and in 10 years it won't have existed." In 2003, an anonymous source mailed photocopies of 2 Eisenflamme blueprint pages to a Berlin newspaper, postmarked from Zurich. The diagrams depict a rocket fuselage nearly identical in dimensions to the later Saturn I test vehicle. U.S. defense officials dismissed the connection as pure coincidence. The originals have never been located. What remains in the official narrative is a footnote, a supposed abandoned mine in the Ore Mountains, cleared by Allied forces in the last week of the war. No mention of the chamber, no mention of Eisenflamme, and no mention of the missing scientists who, according to a fragmentary British Army Signal Corps intercept, were moved under non-German identifiers to a western maritime port on May 12, 1945. The shaft itself collapsed in the winter of 1946, according to local authorities, during unauthorized excavation. Aerial reconnaissance photographs from the following year show the site bulldozed, the spoil heaps leveled, and a single watchtower still standing. By 1950, even that was gone. To this day, no Allied or Axis record conclusively states how close Eisenflamme came to completion, or whether the chamber in the Ore Mountains was the only one. But in the cold arithmetic of the early Cold War, the technology's existence was perhaps more valuable than its launch. In the eyes of those who secured it, the real victory lay not in preventing its use in 1945, but in ensuring it would be used, by the right hands, in the decades to follow. The morning of April 14, 1952, the Soviet submarine B-77, a Whiskey-class patrol vessel under the command of Captain Lieutenant Victor S. Lebedev, was conducting a routine sweep in the Barents Sea. The seas were calm, visibility poor, low fog shrouded the water's surface. At 0930 hours, sonar detected an anomalous metallic contact drifting approximately 40 nautical miles northeast of Kildin Island. When the vessel surfaced to investigate, crewmen spotted a small, unmarked craft adrift, its paint stripped by weather and salt. The hull bore no registration, but the metal rivets and frame structure were consistent with mid-1940s German construction. Inside the cabin, water pooled ankle-deep. Crates, secured with rusted wire, were stacked against the bulkhead, each marked with faded Luftwaffe insignia and an inventory number beginning R45. The decision to bring the crates aboard was made quickly. By Soviet naval procedure, the find was designated Flotsam Category 2, Potential Intelligence Value. Within hours, the B-77 was en route to Murmansk under radio silence. Once in port, the crates were transferred to a secure GRU storage facility. Technicians from the Soviet Ministry of Defense discovered their contents: tightly wrapped rolls of photographic reconnaissance film, each labeled with mission dates, weather conditions, and frame numbers. The most recent mission date was April 7, 1945, a full month before Germany's unconditional surrender. The images were developed under controlled conditions in Leningrad. What emerged startled analysts: high-resolution oblique aerial photographs of infrastructure, bridges, fuel depots, and industrial complexes, in locations absent from all post-war maps. Some sites appeared deep within Soviet territory as defined in 1952, others in remote parts of northern Scandinavia. Notably, many bore no resemblance to wartime targets. Their architectural features suggested post-war construction, yet the film stock and aging were consistent with the 1945 markings. A GRU analytical memorandum dated May 2, 1952, classified Osobo Vaznoi, top priority, speculated that the photographs might depict projected or planned sites, not existing ones. possibly the product of a German cartographic intelligence unit anticipating post-war geopolitical boundaries. Another theory, considered but never proven, was that the images had been taken in 1945 but not developed until after the war, their actual capture date altered for deception. Western intelligence learned of the find through an unlikely channel. An MI6 informant inside the Soviet Naval Photographic Directorate, codenamed Sable, reported the recovery to London via encrypted burst transmission on May 19, 1952. The information reached CIA Station Berlin within 72 hours, triggering a joint Anglo-American analysis operation under the informal designation Project Turn. Declassified fragments of Project Turn correspondence reveal a quiet scramble. Both MI6 and CIA sought to determine whether similar Luftwaffe film caches had been intercepted elsewhere. A cable from CIA Berlin to Langley dated June 4, 1952, notes, "If accurate, implications are significant for both World War II historical record and current strategic mapping. Cross-check all OSS archives for unaccounted Luftwaffe recce sorties March, May 45. Intriguingly, an unredacted passage in the same cable lists one of the photograph sites as Sector Delta 4, coordinates aligning closely with a classified NATO radar installation in northern Norway, built in 1950, 5 years after the supposed capture date. The possibility that German reconnaissance aircraft had overflown sites destined for post-war NATO use introduced a disturbing timeline inconsistency. By late summer, Western analysts suspected that at least some of the photographs might be fabrications designed by a surviving German intelligence cell to sow confusion during the early Cold War. Yet technical analysis, emulsion aging tests, chemical composition of the negatives, consistently affirmed their origin as wartime film stock. On September 12, 1952, a Soviet intelligence bulletin reported that several rolls of the film were missing from the GRU archive. The suspected culprit was never named, but internal suspicion fell on a naval intelligence officer with known access to foreign currency, an indicator of clandestine dealings. No arrests were made, and the officer was transferred to a desk post in Vladivostok. In 1960, 8 years after the Barents Sea recovery, a small cache of identical Luftwaffe-marked film canisters appeared in a Zurich antiquarian shop, offered quietly to a former OSS photo analyst. The canisters vanished before any purchase was made. When questioned decades later, the analyst insisted that the sample frames he viewed in Zurich matched those described in the 1952 GRU report, down to a distinctive watermark from the Luftbildstelle, air photo section, in Berlin. Today, no publicly accessible archive contains the original negatives recovered by B-77. The only surviving documentation consists of partial Soviet inventory logs, scattered GRU analytical summaries, and 3 low-quality microfilm reproductions seized by MI6 in 1954. 2 of these frames show indistinct industrial landscapes. The third depicts an array of radio masts in an uninhabited coastal area, an area that, in 1952, was indeed uninhabited, but by 1958 housed a critical component of the Soviet Northern Early Warning Network. Whether the Barents Sea film was an extraordinary case of late-war reconnaissance, an elaborate post-war forgery, or something even more calculated remains unsettled. The files on Project Turn were formally closed in 1967. The Soviet designation was archived in 1974. In neither case was any public disclosure made. The drifting vessel's hull was scrapped in Murmansk the year after its recovery, and its precise origin remains as obscure as the intent behind the photographs it carried. At 2,215 hours on May 9, 1945, less than 24 hours after the formal cessation of hostilities in Europe, an intercept station of the U.S. Army Signal Corps 118th Monitoring Service, operating out of a temporary post near Landshut, detected a faint, structured burst on the 10.2 MHz band. The signal was intermittent, cycling every 12 minutes, and bore the distinct formatting of high-grade military cipher traffic. Direction-finding triangulation placed the source in the vicinity of Regensburg, specifically within the grounds of a Benedictine monastery overlooking the Danube. The station's log, still held in partial form in the U.S. National Archives, notes, "Signal exhibits Enigma procedural signature, possibly 4-rotor variant. Immediate action, notify G2 liaison." The timing was unusual. German military forces had surrendered the day before. All known Enigma-equipped stations were presumed inactive or in Allied custody. The intercept was passed to the 7th Army Signal Intelligence Service, SIS, which dispatched a 3-vehicle detachment under Captain William H. Durant to the monastery grounds on the morning of May 10. According to Durant's after-action memorandum, the monks offered no resistance but appeared nervous and hesitant when questioned about any radio apparatus. A sweep of the upper floors revealed a concealed loft space accessible only via a hidden stairwell. Inside, SIS personnel found a functioning Lorenz shortwave transmitter, power generators, and, most notably, a Kriegsmarine M4 Enigma machine connected to a modified typewriter-like printer for message transcription. The equipment was warm to the touch, indicating recent use. 3 cipher message tapes were recovered from the printer. Their headers bore the designation NK, Nachtjager, to K, Night Hunter, with routing references pointing to an unknown recipient in Madrid, Spain. None of the messages were decrypted on site. Durant was ordered to secure all equipment and forward it to the SIS detachment in Munich. From May 10 through June 2, the Regensburg source continued to transmit, now under covert Allied monitoring. Attempts to trace the Madrid recipient met with resistance from both Spanish authorities and diplomatic channels, as Spain maintained its wartime policy of strategic ambiguity. Messages were uniformly addressed to K and contained structured groups of 5 letters, consistent with encrypted field-grade instructions. On June 3, without warning, the transmissions ceased. A subsequent sweep of the monastery found the loft stripped bare, the floorboards stained with what Durant described in a personal letter as a dark fluid, possibly oil, possibly something else. No monks were missing, but one, Father Matthias Keller, was later identified as a former Luftwaffe signals officer. Keller was turned over to the Counterintelligence Corps, CIC, and interrogated at length, yet no official transcript of his debriefing has surfaced. By midsummer 1945, decrypted fragments of the earlier transmissions began circulating within Allied intelligence. British cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park, still operational during the immediate post-war period, determined that several messages contained references to Archive Schwarz, Archive Black, and Evacuierungspfad 9, Evacuation Path 9. Cross-referencing OSS files suggested that these were code names for a network of post-surrender exfiltration routes used to move personnel and documents from Germany into neutral territories. The recurring K in the headers was eventually linked to a high-value asset codenamed Nachtjager, believed to be a senior Luftwaffe night fighter ace with deep connections to wartime signals intelligence. OSS internal memoranda speculate that Nachtjager had been providing targeting data for clandestine operations even after the surrender. Whether his post-war activities aligned with Allied or Axis interests remained unclear. By August 1945, the surviving index cards cataloging the Regensburg transmissions vanished from the British Army's Field Signals Archive in London. An internal inquiry found no sign of forced entry. The file cabinet containing the cards had simply been emptied and relocked. Several officers with access were reassigned to Far East intelligence posts within weeks. No confirmed sighting of Nachtjager appears in open-source historical records after 1945, yet fragmentary CIA case summaries from the early 1950s suggest that an individual matching his description may have served as an unofficial advisor during the establishment of NATO's integrated air defense system. These references are sparse and heavily redacted, but they imply that Nachtjager's expertise in long-range radar countermeasures was indispensable during early Cold War planning. The Regensburg transmissions remain a classified anomaly in post-war signals history, one of the rare instances in which verified Enigma traffic was intercepted after the cessation of German hostilities. Whether they represented the last gasp of a dying command network, a deliberate act of disinformation, or the opening moves of a new intelligence game is a question left unanswered by the incomplete and scattered record. The monastery itself still stands. Its archives hold no official mention of radio equipment or wartime transmissions. Inquiries in the 1970s by German historians were met with polite denials. Yet a single photograph, taken in May 1945 by an unknown U.S. Army photographer, shows Captain Durant standing beside the captured M4 machine, his hand resting on the printer, the monastery's stone walls in the background. In the margin, in faded pencil, is a note. K was here. We were too late. On February 17, 1946, a joint British-American salvage crew operating under the Combined Inland Waterways Recovery Group was tasked with clearing navigational hazards from the western end of the Kiel Canal. The war had ended 9 months prior, but the waterway remained littered with wreckage, scuttled vessels, collapsed cranes, and debris from Allied bombing raids. At 0945 hours, divers from the Royal Navy's clearance diving team located an intact steel container wedged beneath a sunken barge. The container, roughly 2 meters in length and fitted with a military-grade locking mechanism, was marked in stenciled white letters, Kriegsgefangenenlager X-17, Prisoner of War Camp X-17. It was hoisted aboard the salvage vessel HMS Falstaff and immediately placed under guard. Upon opening the container in the presence of both British and American officers, its contents were found to include meticulously preserved field reports, aerial reconnaissance maps, and an official roster of 67 Allied prisoners of war. The last entries in the roster were dated March 12, 1945. None of the names corresponded to individuals listed as repatriated in post-war POW recovery logs. Most alarming was a series of handwritten notations in the margins of the camp's final report, referencing Verlegungskorridor 8/9, Relocation Corridor August 9th. Cross-referenced coordinates placed the corridor's route from northern Bavaria through western Czechoslovakia, terminating inside what was, by 1946, the Soviet occupation zone in Germany. The implication that Allied POWs were moved eastward in the war's closing weeks triggered immediate classification of the find. On February 19th, the container's contents were separated. British intelligence retained the original roster and several maps, while the Americans took possession of the aerial photographs and certain coded field reports. The two halves of the file were never officially reunited. A declassified War Office memo from March 1946 acknowledges the existence of Corridor 8 and 9, but concludes, without explanation, that no further action is required. U.S. Army G-2 archives contain a parallel entry dated the same week, noting potential Soviet custody of high-value returnees, political ramifications considerable. Interviews with surviving members of the salvage crew decades later suggest a more complex scene on the day of recovery. Chief Petty Officer Alan Redvers recalled being instructed by a plainclothes officer to sign a second, altered logbook indicating that the container had been recovered empty. "It was the first time I'd ever been told to lie in an official capacity," he told a BBC oral history project in 1978. In April 1946, British Field Security Section officers attempted to investigate Kriegsgefangenenlager X-17 itself. They found the site, located in Schleswig-Holstein, abandoned and stripped. Local farmers reported that in late March 1945, truck convoys had departed the camp under heavy guard, heading southeast. One farmer recalled overhearing guards speaking of special orders from Berlin and a new destination beyond the border. By 1947, fragments of the X-17 file began appearing in unrelated intelligence collections. A single aerial photograph from the container surfaced in a CIA review of wartime industrial sabotage, annotated in red pencil, "Check against Soviet rail junctions, April 1945. Another map, origin unknown, was discovered in the Bundesarchiv in 1964, its legend bearing the corridor designation. The fate of the 67 prisoners remains undocumented. None appear in International Committee of the Red Cross repatriation lists, nor in Soviet archival records released after the Cold War. Some names, however, correspond to individuals known to have participated in Allied interrogation of captured German scientists, raising the possibility that their disappearance was related less to their status as prisoners and more to the knowledge they possessed. An internal NATO intelligence briefing from 1952, still partially classified, references the X-17 precedent during a discussion of jurisdiction over captured personnel in potential future conflicts. The briefing notes that ad hoc transfers of high-value detainees to non-declared partners posed both ethical and operational challenges. Local records in Kiel show that the salvage operations manifest for February 17, 1946, makes no mention of the container. Instead, the log lists miscellaneous scrap metal recovered from the canal. This discrepancy was first noted by a German historian in 1991, but requests for clarification from British and U.S. naval archives yielded no additional documentation. The steel container itself was last recorded in a British Army Ordnance Depot in Hamburg in June 1946. Its subsequent location is unknown. The only surviving visual evidence is a single, grainy photograph taken on deck aboard HMS Falstaff, showing 3 men standing beside it. The stenciled letters X-17 are visible, partially obscured by rust. In the photograph's margin, written in faint pencil, is an unfiled notation, "Not for registry, forward to corridor." On October 14, 1962, less than a week before President Kennedy's televised address on the Cuban Missile Crisis, a sealed folder was hand-delivered to the CIA's Deputy Director for Plans, Richard M. Bissell Jr. Its cover bore only the stamp, "Ashfall, operational." Inside was a series of memoranda tracing back to a little-known OSS briefing dated November 23, 1944. The original OSS file, compiled by Section X, responsible for maritime sabotage, detailed German U-boat supply stations in the South Atlantic, codenamed Stützpunkt Grau, Gray Station. The report identified several small islands and remote coves along the Brazilian and West African coasts where Kriegsmarine vessels had established hidden refueling caches, often camouflaged as fishing settlements. The war ended before most could be destroyed, and their exact coordinates were relegated to a sealed annex in OSS archives. According to the Ashfall file, these locations were reactivated in the late 1950s, not by surviving German elements but under the direction of U.S. intelligence. The rationale was simple: unmarked aircraft, primarily modified C-97 stratofreighters, required clandestine refueling points to bypass both civilian air traffic controls and official basing agreements. The operational term was maritime overtake, a mid-sea link-up between an aircraft and a small supply vessel anchored in a hidden inlet. Declassified fragments from the file describe a 1959 field trial in which a stratofreighter, flying under a non-existent registration number, refueled twice en route from Ascension Island to an undisclosed location in the South American interior. The supply vessel in both cases was a converted coastal freighter registered to a shell company in Montevideo. What drew the 1962 urgency was an incident logged by the Argentine fishing trawler San Miguel. On September 22 of that year, while operating near the Tristan da Cunha archipelago, the crew reported sighting a black-winged transport descending at dusk toward a small bay on an uninhabited island. Through binoculars, the trawler's captain observed a vessel, matching descriptions of World War II-era German supply ships, moored alongside. The aircraft's engines idled for 20 minutes before it departed northward under strict radio silence. The San Miguelis logbook, later obtained by Argentine naval intelligence, contained exact times, compass bearings, and weather conditions, all consistent with a covert refueling operation. Within 2 weeks, the logbook was in CIA hands, delivered through a Buenos Aires station cutout. No official acknowledgement was made to Argentine authorities. One grainy satellite photograph, taken by a KH-4 Corona reconnaissance satellite on September 27, 1962, shows a vessel in the same bay with an unidentified dark shape on shore, blurred beyond recognition due to cloud cover. The image was filed under a generic maritime surveillance code and nearly discarded before being tagged by an analyst familiar with Ashfall coordinates. The CIA's internal response was immediate. An operational cable from Langley to field stations in Recife, Dakar, and Ascension Island ordered asset stand-down and contingency routing for all maritime overtake points in the South Atlantic. In the same week, the Ashfall briefing was placed under the same classification protocols as U-2 reconnaissance flights. Notably, the 1944 OSS annex that formed the basis of Ashfall remained missing from official archives until a single page surfaced in 1981, offered anonymously to a Washington Post reporter. That page contained only a list of coordinates and a penciled notation, Grau, for destroyed 745ths, others intact. The reporter, under pressure from unnamed government contacts, never published the find. The vessels themselves, converted from wartime supply ships, were quietly retired in the late 1960s. One, registered as MV Pelican Star, was sold for scrap in Durban in 1968. South African port records list its dimensions as identical to those of the Kriegsmarine's Type 14 Milchkuh submarine tenders, minus submerged capability. By the early 1970s, all mention of Ashfall vanished from CIA operational summaries. Its personnel and funding were absorbed into broader maritime logistics programs. Yet hints of its continued existence appear in obscure naval attaché reports from that decade. References to Atlantic Station 5 and Airbridge fallback sites suggest that the infrastructure was mothballed rather than dismantled. The strategic logic of Ashfall mirrored its wartime origin, maintaining supply lines invisible to both allies and adversaries. In 1944, it had been a desperate measure by a collapsing regime. In 1962, it was a calculated move in a global standoff, its secrecy preserved not for survival but for strategic advantage. Today, none of the identified ground stations appear on maritime charts. Aerial imagery shows only weathered rock, surf, and the remnants of rotting timber pilings. But in classified holdings, if they still exist, the coordinates remain. The last line of the surviving Ashfall memorandum is blunt. In the event of hostile interdiction of conventional routes, ground network will be reactivated within 72 hours. Authorization: highest level. The paper trail ends abruptly, not with answers, but with erasures, names stripped away, coordinates blacked out, dates replaced with silence. What remains are fragments sharp enough to wound, even decades later. If these records were destroyed, it wasn't to protect the guilty. It was to keep the rest of us from understanding just how much of the past still waits, buried and breathing, under the thin soil of the present.